Let's now talk a little bit about the decline and the reform movements within the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire reaches the height of its power under the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, as he's known in the West, or Suleiman the Lawgiver, as he's known in the East, in the Ottoman lands. He lived from 1494 till 1566, and as you can see, he had a predilection for big hats, and on this photo his hat is somewhat smaller. This is an image that is hanging in the United States House of Representatives, where he's featured as one of 20 plus famous lawgivers in human history. So he's a man of the law, and he focused on reforming the Qanun, the laws that were within the realm of the state to engage, as opposed to the Sharia, which is the divine law made by private scholars, as we discussed. But we will not so much talk about Suleiman right now as such. His empire is an enormous, almost a superpower in modern parlance, a great power with extensive reach and great ambition still, and is also an extremely active supporter of the arts and of culture. Here you see in this painting, this is the Suleymaniye Mosque that the famous Ottoman architect Sinan built for Suleiman, and is named after him. And as you can easily see, it is modeled on the Christian church, the Hagia Sophia, that was built in Byzantine times in Constantinople, and whose was a magnificent way of building that had been lost by that time, and that Sinan managed to rediscover and build again in the Suleymaniye Mosque. And as we will see later on, it's a particular way of building mosques that has become very influential. So it is at the end of Suleiman's reign that we see the height of Ottoman expansion. And if you look at the map now, we see a very extensive empire around the southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean, and with strong holdings in the Balkans and towards Europe, and encroaching on Europe, as we discussed earlier on. It had an ambition towards Europe. So it is now here at this map, is from 1609. It shows the period when the Ottoman Empire is, in a sense, admitted into the club of the European great powers. It becomes now a bona fide European power that affects the course of military affairs in Europe, certainly in the Mediterranean. Obviously, this geographical expansion and maintenance is built on military strength, and the Ottoman Empire at this period had an extremely competitive military structure, very effective navy, very effective army, good weapons production, and a highly disciplined armed force. And perhaps this is a good moment to dwell a little bit on the particular type of the military force on which the Ottomans rely. Here you have a European painting by a Janissary soldier I think it's by Gentili. And the slave soldier system is a peculiar Muslim institution that began in 830 under the Abbasids, and then was continued with the Ottomans, who started with it formally in 1383 and maintained it for 500 years right up to its abolition in 1826. And what we, in modern parlance, we equate slavery with an extremely unfavorable social position. But it's important to remember that in the way it played out in Muslim periods, it was a social status that opened up avenues for social mobilities right up to the very top of the hierarchy. We have, not in Ottoman periods, but in other Muslim societies, particularly in Egypt, these slave soldiers actually became the rulers and certainly decided who the Sultan would be, and the Sultan was often drawn from their own circles. So how did this system function? You see here in this painting at contemporary period from the area, it shows how young boys are brought to the Sultan to enter the training for to become janissaries. And janissaries is the term the Turks used. In Egyptian periods it was called mamluks, which means the property of the Sultan. So the system was that young boys would be either captured, and in later periods they were actually sold by their parents, often and that's important, always in non-Muslim areas. So these are often Christian or other boys of other religions that were selected, and the selection process was fairly rigid. They were bought as slaves, were brought to the capital, and then entered particular training institutions where further selection was happening. And at that time, then they were circumcised and converted to Islam and taught Turkish, and were schooled and underwent military training and discipline. And discipline was very harsh. And the idea and the particular source of the strength of these slave soldiers was that these young boys who were uprooted, both culturally and family-wise, now made the core, became de facto their family. And for long periods of Muslim history, they were actually prohibited from marrying or from having families, so they remained within the core. And the core and the owner, who was ultimately the Sultan and higher military officers, took care of him and his needs. And they were very disciplined and a very, very effective fighting force. And as we mentioned already last week, it was these type of soldiers, the Mamluks in Egypt, who defeated the Mongol onslaught in 1258. And it's the same type of military organization that is also at the source of Ottoman military strength throughout much of its history. The problem with the janissaries is that over time the rigid rules that were the source of its military effectiveness were eroded. Janissaries began to marry, they began to ensure that their own offspring would get into the system, which previously was strictly prohibited. And they became local extractors of local rents, basically, without actually delivering military services. So there's now a paradoxical situation at the end of the 18th century and persisting all throughout the 19th century, right up to the First World War, where the Ottoman Empire is large but internally weak and is no longer able to defend itself very effectively against outside encroachment, and is also no longer able to maintain internal control and stability as well as it could have and was needing to do. And the paradox is here now that all other European nations had territorial or strategic interests in the territories of the Ottoman Empire, but all of them were at the same time concerned about territorial gains being made by other European nations, upsetting the balance of power overall in Europe. So we have this paradoxical situation that the Ottoman Empire is now weak and is unable to assert itself, but it's actually propped up by its competitors, not because they feel sympathy for the Ottoman Empire, but because they are worried about the gains from a disintegration of the empire accruing to the other European nations, and thereby that the overall stability of the European balance of power would be affected. So the Ottoman Empire is now leaving on borrowed time, so to say. The 19th century does not treat the Ottomans very well. It starts off badly in 1804 till 1815. You have the Serbian Revolution here in the northern, the Balkan holdings begin to very strong unrest. You have, and which begins the period of nationalist agitation, particularly in the Balkans, which then later on in the 20th century also spread to the Arab and other holdings of the Ottomans. So it begins with the Serbian uprising in 1804, 1815, and you have Greece becoming independent in 1830 there's also an uprising and strong support by the European powers. Then you have in 1831 till 1833, Muhammad Ali of Egypt, formerly a loyal subject of the empire, actually attacks the empire and takes much of the Syrian province and establishes himself there. And the Ottomans try to meet him militarily, but are heavily beaten by Muhammad Ali, now modern reformed army, and they can only repel him from Syria with the help of the Europeans in 1839, which then leads in 1840 to the Convention of London, where the European great powers formally commit themselves to the maintenance of the Ottoman Empire, to the continued existence of the Ottoman Empire, which, as I said before, it's a little bit of a paradoxical situation. So out of this convention, Muhammad Ali of Egypt becomes a hereditary vice king of Egypt, but recognizes Ottoman suzerainty. The Crimean War in 1854 till 1856, in which the Ottoman Empire is fighting against the Russian Empire, and it's allied with Britain and France, is formally won, but the result of that war is not very auspicious for the Ottomans. It leads to strong resentment in Turkey. It begins a period of reform in Turkey, and ultimately to the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 till 78, which leads to the ultimate independence of Bulgaria, and later on the loss of the Bosnia-Herzegovina to Austria, and Romania and Serbia become fully independent at that time. So, and ultimately these Balkan countries will ally themselves and attack the Ottoman Empire in 1912 and 1913. And all this is ultimately the outcome of the Crimean War. One strong symbol of the situation in which the Ottoman Empire has now maneuvered itself into is the near autonomy, the virtual autonomy enjoyed by Egypt under Muhammad Ali at that time. The Maghreb rulers further to the east of Egypt had similarly assumed more or less autonomous status, only nominally recognizing the suzerainty of the Ottoman Sultan. And at any rate, since 1830, Algeria has become a French protectorate, and then Tunisia and Morocco follow a few decades later and fall under French control. So we see that the Ottoman Empire is now under considerable pressure. So in parts of the Ottoman Empire, particularly in the higher administration and in the military leadership, there's now realization that reform is needed, that stagnation continuing as it was will lead to disintegration of the empire. And we mentioned already last week the precedent of the Japanese reform movement from starting in 1868. And there's now the precedent of Russian reform that sets in in 1856 after the lost Crimean War. There is the precedent within the Ottoman lands of basically autonomous Egypt under Muhammad Ali that embarks on an extremely ambitious modernization period starting in 1804. So there's now a realization in the Ottoman Empire that we need to do the same if we want to stay alive and if we want to ensure the survival of the empire. And in the Ottoman Empire, this reform takes the characteristic of military reform, because that seems to be the most pressing. So there's now the introduction of military drill, military trainers drawn from Europe, the beginning creation of military schools to train leaders. But there's also the realization that ultimately railways, telegraphs, modern production armament productions have to be adopted as well in order to meet that military challenge. The measures taken were very ambitious, and they took a very long time to produce results. The Ottoman Empire did not really reap the benefits from them, but we see that the army that then ultimately won the Turkish War of Liberation is a result of these reforms that were started now in the 19th century. So in a sense, there is a belated success to these reforms. More importantly than the military aspects of this reform are, however, the administrative and legal reforms that were started almost as an afterthought to the military reforms. And there came to be known the period as Tanzimat the beneficial reorderment or adjustment of society that begins in 1839 and goes right up to 1876, and depending on how you count, some would even say up to 1908. But the most important reform edicts, there's three, and I'll ask you to pay attention to the dates in which they are promulgated. So the first that starts the Tanzimat, the reform movement, is the Khat Sharife Golkhane. Golkhane is a palace in which the edict was promulgated from 3rd November 1839. And it sought primarily, and I'm quoting, to bring the benefits of a good administration to the provinces of the Ottoman Empire through new institutions. And as it stated itself, this is now the beginning where we see a central bank is created. There is a military college is created. Specialized colleges for military doctors are created. The post office is ultimately created, etc. So it focuses on the creation of institutions, physical organizational bodies that do certain things in which the Ottoman Empire is lacking. The next important reform document is the Khat Homayun Islahat Farmani. I apologize to the Turks in the audience, my pronunciation is Persian. It's the Imperial Reform Edict of, and now note the date again, it's the 18th February of 1856. And this document, whereas the first document primarily sought to create new institutions, the Khat Homayun aims to create legal equality among the Ottoman citizens, to create a common Ottoman citizenship and abolish the system of personalized religious communities that we had before. And this is a very, very momentous decision taken, and we will see that it has certain problems attached with it. But the aim is to create an equal, creed-blind Ottoman citizenship and open the recruitment into the administration and the military to non-Muslims, and to ensure that all Ottoman citizens, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, would have equal access to courts and be treated equally before the law. And then the third important reform edict is the Qanun Asasi, the first Ottoman constitution of 23rd December 1876. And the combined effect of these three reform edicts is very, very important, very large. It leads to a transformation of society. It's far-reaching, but while these legal changes and the institutional creation continue well into the 20th century and affect life in the 20th century, it's important to remember that overall the reforms remain half-hearted and insufficient to meet the challenge. And the explanations for this are manifold. Three elements I'd like to point out, but there are obviously more factors involved here. The first element, this is a revolution from above. It's a decision taken by the top bureaucrats and the Sultan. And it's a very small group that have a certain vision. But there is no popular movement whose demands are being met with these reforms. And therefore, there's also no natural ally in this process. That's the first aspect, the revolution from above by a very small group of people. Second, there are strong social interests who are now negatively affected by these reforms. Parts are the religious establishment in all of the communities whose interests are being negatively affected. Now the state takes over the two primary areas in which they had been dominant, namely education and the administration of justice, and who therefore now seek to undermine these reforms in order to protect their normative but also material interests. And the third element, and it's not an inconsequential point, is that these, and I asked you to pay attention to the dates when these reform edicts were promulgated. These reform edicts are now being pronounced in response to European pressure for reform aimed at betterment of the minorities that most of the European powers had an interest in. So they sought to improve the lot of the minorities which they had protected and for which the Ottoman Empire had to give them legal rights to represent these minorities in the capitulation treaties that had been imposed on the Ottoman empires in the previous period. But remember the paradox I mentioned earlier on. At the same time, the European powers are not really interested in creating a strong Ottoman Empire. They have particular narrow self-interests in these lands, but they are committed to maintaining the institution. So the pressure that's coming from the outside is double-edged. It aims at improving the minorities' position, but at the same time, it steps short and it seeks to prevent any movement, any reforms that would really make the Ottoman state stronger. And now, if you remember the dates, we have the first edict in 1839, which is at the time when the Ottoman Empire has to rely on European help to repel the expansion of Muhammad Ali's Egypt into Syria, 1839. You have 1856, which is at the same time where the Ottoman Empire has to rely on European allies to fight off Russia in the Crimean War. And it's the European publics that force their governments to put pressure in normative terms here. And then ultimately, the constitution that's promulgated in 1876, again, comes at the end, at the beginning of the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78. So, and the constitution was aimed, among other things, in creating a favorable public opinion in the European lands to support the Ottoman Empire in this period. And as you see on this painting here, this is now the Berlin Conference that settled the Russo-Turkish War and that sought to stabilize the position that came out of this war, and sought to stabilize this weak and declining Ottoman Empire for reasons of balance of power, as I said before. Now, whatever the inadequacy of the reforms, it's clear that they had a strong impact. What is the effect of these reforms? It's important to remember that the combined effect of the military, administrative, and legal changes wrought by these reforms dramatically increased the capacity of the Ottoman Empire, of the state, to do anything with its population. It might have still been insufficient to meet the challenge from outside, but internally it's now able to do things that it had never been able to do before. So remember, it used to be a somewhat aloof, thin form of government, and now it's able to do a lot more. So it's no longer a distant, relatively harmless state, but much more interfering in the lives of its citizens. And this greater scope for interference, combined with the nationalist ideology that is simultaneously developing in Europe and is rapidly spreading to the Balkans and later on also to other parts of the Ottoman era, is now creating a very toxic mix for the Ottoman state, because communities that had basically been left alone are now subject to conscription, subject to higher taxation, subject to higher police powers, and at the same time these communities now start to develop an identity that is distinct from the Ottoman identity. So they now see themselves as Serbs, as Bulgarians, as Romanians, ultimately as Arabs. We'll come back to that toxic mix of nationalist agitation and greater state ability to interfere with its subjects throughout this course, as the other nations develop their own statehood. But for now, let's dwell a little on the legal forms that the reform movement took. We have now, in the beginning of the 19th century, greater commercial interaction between the Ottoman Empire and mainly European tradesmen, who are now also resident in Ottoman lands. And as a result of the capitulations, now most of the minorities and certainly all of the European citizens are virtually exempt from the jurisdiction of the Ottoman state. So the response taken is to create mixed courts composed, as you can see here, this is a contemporary picture of such a mixed court. They are composed of Europeans, judges, and Ottoman judges, often the local consuls. And it's in these courts that commercial disputes involving Ottoman citizens, both Muslim and non-Muslim in particular, and European subjects are adjudicated. And these mixed courts apply the commercial code, the Qanunnameh Tijarat from 1850, which is basically an exact translation of the relevant French commercial code. These courts, however, were unable to cope with the rising number of cases as commerce grew. So the question now arose, in which venue should these debates take place, these disputes take place? And the Muslim Qadi courts, that would be the most obvious alternative, they were rather unattractive to Europeans, because given these courts were applying traditional Islamic law and followed traditional Islamic procedure, and therefore the right to witness of non-Muslims was basically non-existent, and generally non-Muslims would be at a disadvantage in these courts. So this would not have been, the Qadi courts would not be a very attractive venue if the state sought to impose a universal court system. So the solution would be to create a civil code and comprehensive civil code that could then be applied by a universal, newly created state system of courts. And now that raises the question, which type of civil code? And initially, the Ottoman Empire followed the lead of the Egyptian approach, which was simply to translate the relevant Code Civil, Code Napoleon as it came to be known, of the French Republic, simply translated into Ottoman Turkish as the Egyptians had translated into Arabic, and use this. But following considerable opposition, not mainly normative opposition by the religious establishment, that project of translation was abandoned halfway through, and instead it was decided to codify existing Islamic rules on commercial law in the Hanafi tradition, tempered by certain rules from the other three Sunni schools of thought. And this collection of commercially relevant Islamic law that was then compiled in the years of 1869 till 1876 came to be known as the Majalla, and it was promulgated in 16 books, ultimately comprising 1,851 individual articles. So it's a very comprehensive effort, and it was then promulgated throughout the Ottoman lands and was then the law that was applied by a newly created state system of courts. For the first time, a Muslim state, or the Muslim state, the Egyptians had gone there before, was now having a unified court structure in which all of the citizens would be, which would be open and responsible for all citizens. But, and this is important, it is now applying basically a codified form of Islamic law. So it's the first time that non-Muslims actually become subject to Islamic law in commercial and in civil law. It's important to remember that family and inheritance law were, again following objections, were left out of that codification effort. So for family and inheritance remain in the private religious communities. It's hard to overstate the impact of the Majalla, of this this codification effort. And here we see here the first page of the Majalla. If you remember, the Ottoman area is very large. This is now the law of the land, and therefore the Majalla continued to be important throughout the Ottoman lands, way beyond the decline of the Ottoman Empire itself. So it remained in Turkey in force only until 1926, when it was abolished and replaced by a civil code created on the French model, as initially had been planned. In Albania until 1928, in Lebanon until 1932, in Syria until 1949, in Iraq until 1953, in Cyprus right up to the 1960s, in Israel right up to 1984, and it remains in slightly altered form in force in Kuwait, in Jordan, and in the Palestinian territories. So you can see that its importance as a legal promulgation is important both for ideational reasons and also in practical reasons, because it has affected the legal reality of a very great proportion of the Muslim populations.